Next talk will be by Raluca Soreanu. She's a psychoanalyst and a professor of psychoanalytic studies in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. She's the author of Working Through Collective Wounds, Trauma, Denial, Recognition in the Brazilian Uprising, and the co-author, again with Jenny Wilner and Jacob Staberg, of Ferenczi Dialogues. At present, Raluca is working on a theoretical clinical monograph, The Psychic Life of Fragments, on splitting and the experience of time in psychoanalysis. And she's the project lead of Freepsy, the free clinics and psychoanalysis of the people, for the people, progressive histories, collective practices, implications for our times. A project that engages collectives that open psychoanalytic spaces to excluded or marginal individuals or groups. In her talk today, Raluca will dive into blue psychoanalysis, Ferenczi's exploration of the sea in Thalassa.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers and our hosts. It's a privilege to be here today. And my talk today is called Blue Psychoanalysis, Ferenczi's Exploration of the Sea in Thalassa, and I think has many lines of dialogue with Jenny and Herman. And it has 4 short parts. First on blue psychoanalysis, the feminine principle, psychoanalysis of organs, and some consequences for the theory of sexuality. So first, a prelude on radical plasticity. Today, I would like to talk to you about the clinical imagination and about the radical plasticity of the psyche. I also would like to talk to you about Sándor Ferenczi's clinical imagination and its contemporary extensions. I believe Ferenczi offers a key revision to the work of Freud in the form of a meta-psychology of fragmented psyches. For Ferenczi, psychic fragmentation is a ubiquitous operation of the psyche. To the Freudian vocabulary of Spaltung, Ferenczi adds a new register of terms. To approach this culture of fragments that are the result of psychic trauma, we need to unpack this unique vocabulary of fragmentation, which includes references to new psychic processes such as fractures, splits, atomizations, pulverizations, leakages, detritus, shattering of psychic matter into particles without form, psychic dematerialization, but also new formations, new organs, protective bladders, expansions, contagions, and inner growths. The Ferencian subject, I would say, bears certain structural similarities to a montage made by cut-out fragments. The organism itself is thought as prepared for art, ready for recombinations, permutations, complex analogies, implants, and implantations. Ferenczi reconfigures the relationship between psyche and soma, and he brings to us a hyphenated psychosoma, where even the hysterical symptom is susceptible to a form of creativity, unfolding in its own language. We are thus able to follow forms of radical plasticity, surprising modes of psychic splitting that result from the scene of trauma, semi-fluid bodies and organs, as Ferenczi calls them, that reshape, retract, and grow new curious parts. In his short piece titled On Shock, Ferenczi creates an important image to register a new kind of fragmentation, a process akin to one of dematerialization. As he writes, shock, annihilation of self-regard, of the ability to put up a resistance and to act and think in defense of one's own self, perhaps even the organs which secure self-preservation, give up their function or reduce it to a minimum. The word Erschütterung is derived from schüttern, to become unfest, unsolid, to lose one's form and to adopt easily and without resistance an imposed form, like a sack of flour. So I ask, what does it mean in today's clinic to follow Ferenci's pathos for transformation? What does it mean to write and to think and to practice clinically at the limit of what we can imagine for bodies and what bodies can imagine for themselves? So now on blue psychoanalysis, in a second move today, I would like to talk to you about the sea, and let us enter the sea through one of Ferenci's texts, a small book published in 1924, Thalassa, A Theory of Genitality. Interestingly, it was written during the First World War, while Ferenczi was stationed in a military hospital in a garrison in Papa. As Jenny Wilner shows, at this time, Ferenczi was also translating Freud's 3 essays in the theory of sexuality. It was thus war trauma by day, and immersion in a kind of psychoanalytic writing from the sea and about sexuality by night. Thalassa is a text of ambivalence in relation to the death drive. It is Ferenci's foundational myth, and it starts from the sea. It is a complex text, but what is important for our discussion today is that it turns biologism on its head. It composes a picture where matter is also driven by psychic motives and capable of processes akin to condensation, displacement, and regression. Ferenczi reads his sources from 19th century popular biology, Lamarck, Haeckel, and Bolsche, as Jenny Wilner has shown, against the grain. Also, in the book I co-authored with Jenny and Jakob Staberg, Ferenci's exploration holds potential for a political intervention against evolutionary thinking, against biologism and eugenicist thought, as Jenny has already spoken to. So let's move closer to some of the odd critters that populate Ferenci's sea in Thalassa, to their destinies, and to the extraordinary importance they play in our attempt to make sense of psychic process and its extreme plasticity. Ferenczi establishes an analogy between sleep, dreams, sex life, and the life of fantasy to look at a continuous regressive trend manifest in psychic life, which strives for the re-establishment of the intrauterine situation. But he also stays with the fish becoming amphibian, which is a reminder of the creative edge of catastrophe, of what the receding of the oceans can enable in terms of creative adaptations and the formation of new organs and ultimately new forms of existence. In Thalassa, psychoanalytic theory is re-embodied, and the bodies are not only human, but also of fish, squid, jellyfish, octopi, and amphibians. In resonance across time with a feminist thinker, Donna Haraway, Ferenczi seems to have an interest in neuronal extravaganzas, and I really like this term. So fibrous entities, flagellated beings, myofibril braids, matted and felted microbial and fungal tangles, probing creepers, swelling roots, reaching and climbing tendrilled ones. What is important in Ferenci's writing is that this keen interest in fish and amphibians does not amount to biologism or to biological determinism. His bioanalysis in Thalassa is an attempt to show the existence of a psychic substratum manifest in all organic and inorganic matter. I believe this gesture of turning to the sea critters is attuned to contemporary feminist thinkers who show us how to pay close attention to marine beings and learn from their breathing techniques, their resilience and their modes of memory and their ways of splitting themselves into fragments and also relating to one another. It is the case, for instance, of Alexis Pauline Gumbs and her writings, Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, and Dub, Finding Ceremony. As the author tells us, her project is an artifact and tool for breath retaining and interspecies ancestral listening. And a few striking questions follow, all relating to interspecies imaginaries. What if you could breathe like whales who sing underwater and recycle air to sing again before they come up for air? What if you could breathe like coral from a multitude of simultaneous openings connected to one source built upon the bones of all your dead? What if you could breathe like cyanobacteria who made the sky into oxygen millions of years ago and sent their contemporaries to a world of sulfur deep under the ocean and ground? All these questions invoke a radical plasticity, the ability to become whale and then to become coral and become cyanobacteria. For Ferenczi, it is the scene of trauma that contains the possibility of such radical and surprising plasticity. In Thalassa, Ferenczi invites us to his own psychoanalytic interspecies story of listening, and I quote from Ferenczi: "Let me ask you to picture the surface of the earth as still entirely enveloped in water. All plant and animal life still pursues its existence in an environment of seawater. Geologic and atmospheric conditions are such that portions of the ocean bed become raised above the surface of the water. The animals and plants thus set upon dry land must either succumb or else adapt themselves to a land and air existence. Above all, they must become habituated to obtaining from the air, instead of from the water, the gases necessary to their existence, oxygen and carbon dioxide." Ferenczi, starting from the sea in his myth of Thalassa, constitute a fresh direction to think with. In our times, voices of the blue humanities start from the sea as a political act, placing cultural history in an oceanic rather than terrestrial context. Human civilization and development have been situated mostly in pastoral fields, enclosed gardens, or cities. What happens if we start from the sailor and the swimmer, from the movement across the oceans, and from estrangement at sea, rather than progressive settlements on land? One of the things that happens is that the perspective changes. It is no longer the gaze of the settler encompassing the land from controlling heights, but it is the unsettled and uncertain view amidst moving waters, ridden with doubts and the constant threat of dissolution. As Steve Mentz argues in Shipwreck Modernity, Ecologies of Globalization, from an oceanic perspective, even the story of modernity is ultimately a story of shipwrecks. It is a catastrophe-ridden epic where expansion happens in relation to sea crossings and to the many disasters waiting to happen. In our times, traversed by migrant crises and with boats capsizing while vulnerable humans are trying to get across borders and walls, it appears ever more important to start from the sea. So I think that blue psychoanalysis is part of the blue humanities. And now on the feminine principle. In the domain of blue psychoanalysis in Thalassa, there is another important thread that I would like to turn to. that of a variety of protective formations that the psychosoma can create. Ferenczi looks at various ad hoc protective bladders, vesicles, or pustulae filled with fluid, usually developed under the strain of the traumatic attack. I consider this as his life drive imaginary, something other than naive vitalism, something other than a generic optimistic image of the prevalence of life over death. So Ferenczi constructs a whole new series of terms which are both clinically and politically interesting. And I pull this thread here with cooperation, conciliation, endurance of suffering, selflessness, appeasement, adaptation to renunciation, self-denial, and compromise. In one entry of the clinical diary, he experiments with a particular modification in the sphere of the dualism, death drive and life drive. He names them the drive of self-assertion and the drive of conciliation. The selflessness he evokes, including the selflessness of organs, emerges in relation to the scene of trauma. The drive for conciliation appears as the basis of the reality principle. To survive as any form of individuality means to practice a kind of politics of self-limitation. It also means a kind of slowness of reaction, or even a temporary non-reactivity, a stillness, or a passibility or passibilité, in French, a term proposed by Dominique Scarfone, drawing on Lyotard's notes. Passibility is a quality of passivity linked to the suffering of sensation. It marks a capacity to endure suffering or feeling, and ultimately an openness to being affected. In Thalassa, there is a moment where Ferenczi imagines the great catastrophe, the drying up of the oceans and marine creatures forced to grow limbs and develop lungs to adapt to life on land. As Jenny Wilner argues, they are creatures that would have preferred not to conquer land. Their plasticity is not triumphant, but restrained and self-limiting. So now a psychoanalysis of organs. With the sea in mind, let us step into the consulting room. Ferenczi explores a psychoanalysis of organs which takes seriously the organ as a site of anxiety and signification, and investigates some fascinating semi-autonomous qualities of organs. He introduces ideas such as organ neurosis, and even the more curious phenomena of organ individuality, and even the cooperation of organs. Organs appear to have a secret life. They are capable of different kinds of regressions, perversions, strangulations, condensation, displacements, and doublings, which we usually attribute to the psychic stratum. And Jenny has already invoked Elizabeth Wilson, who comments on this kind of processes. So we enter a clinical imaginary of wise organs. As Ferenczi states, when the psychic system fails, the organ begins to think. The accent here is on the productive and materializing force of hysteria. The lump in the throat of the hysteric patient is not merely a hallucination, but it is part of a new grammar of organs, a stirring up of the tissues of the throat, or of the contents of the stomach, or of the intestinal matter, which implies a capacity for condensation, displacement, or repetition, or even identification. This showcasing of the creativities of the hysterical symptom has important implications for how we can imagine the relationship between psyche and soma. In short, I think there is a horizontalizing gesture here where soma is just as capable of complex acts as the psyche. So in Thalassa, Ferenczi talks about an internal qualitative differentiation in the sphere of the libido, which can lead to an organ libido or even an organ individuality. And as he writes, and I quote here, according to the theory of genitality, the cooperation of organs and of their component parts does not consist simply of the automatic adding together of useful workmen to give a sum total of performance. Each organ possesses a certain individuality. In each and every organ, there is repeated conflict between ego and libidinal interests, which too we have encountered here too only in the analysis of psychic individualities. So Ferenczi differentiates even between the altruistic functioning of organs and the autoerotic or self-gratifying processes in the tissues. Organs are thus capable of cooperation, but this is not a guaranteed outcome. Of course, it takes struggle and a complicated negotiation between opposing forces. The selflessness evoked, including the selflessness of organs, emerges in relation to the scene of trauma. And now, finally, a part of implications or extensions to the a revised theory of sexuality. I believe that in Thalassa, Ferenczi makes a de-Oedipalizing intervention. I'm referring to Ferenci's idea of amphimixis of eroticism, a construction that can impact the way we think through different forms of relationality. His focus is not on component instincts, but on the outcome that they can lead through their encounter, while understanding that this is not a peaceful, harmonious, or conflict-free one. It may be a clash. Ferenczi talks about the fusion of different eroticisms containing different pleasurable and painful experiences with different object relations and forms of displacement in a way that transcends any strictly individual horizon of references. He names the fusion of eroticism amphimixis, a medical term that denotes the mingling of two substances, usually to create a third. In Greek, the prefix amphi means on two sides. There is no unilinear, irreversible, or progressive sexual development of the individual, but rather every act that we might wish to analyze will be a mix of infantile, adult, oral, anal, and genital components. This mix will be unique and irreducible to its components. So amphimixis, I think, refers to individuals, but also their relations. As I see it, it is at the heart of a radical vision. This non-dualistic and non-linear thinking constitutes a democratization of form of erotism. Ferenczi creatively decenters the genital register. He displaces the primacy of the genital over the other component instincts. And I think his language is horizontal, as he argues that, and I quote, the genital would then no longer be the unique and incomparable magic wand which conjures erotisms from all the organs of the body. On the contrary, genital amphimixis would merely be one particular instance of the many such fusions in which such fusions of erotisms takes place. Genitality is read in Thalassa as a retrogression to the original striving of being immersed in the womb and its gratifications. But beyond the genital amphimixis, the psyche is capable, and I quote here again, of a clever combination of mechanisms of pleasure. So I think there is still a grappling, a sort of pressing need for psychoanalysis to grapple with the ways it has written, for instance, the feminine in the negative, and also to grapple with non-normative sexualities. So an interesting route for addressing this is to experiment with a meta-psychology constructed in the feminine and the connection between the construct and biological sex is never straightforward, but it is a machine for producing relevant questions. Another equally important route, which I think Ferenczi definitely helps us with, is to degender and disassociate the series of terms that have historically been gendered in a binary way with conservative effects. For instance, the masculine with its association with life drive and activity, and the feminine with death drive and passivity. And I think there are such important roots in Ferenczi here. I have followed the way that Ferenczi shows an interest in intermediary forms in the field of sexuality, which are neither nor or are both and, if we consider the categories of feminine and masculine. So the implications of this double move are wide-ranging and, as I try to show, can lead to an important revision in the theory of sexuality. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for highlighting this very interesting point of view. Are there any questions in the room? Perhaps? Oh, yeah.
Just very curious about the art and the artist Hannah Hoch. Could you perhaps say something about these images and why you selected them?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. It is a journey here of some sort of meaningful analogy. I think that we have started in our previous book, which I co-authored with Jenny Wilner and Jakob Starberg, and we stumbled across this fantastic collage by Dada artist Hannah Hoch, and thought that it condensed in such an interesting way what we were trying to say also about Ferenczi's theory of the subject and the connection with the theme of montage and the idea of fragments and recomposing the fragments into a new arrangement. So we got quite deep into analyzing this particular image, which I've used once. I think it was in the cover of the book only. Yeah, it's here. So this fantastic image that we used for the cover was for us a journey of making some important points and discussing the question of montage and its centrality in this theory of the subject. And then I think from there, I have been on a continuous journey about trying to think montage and Ferenczi's work. And this idea of recomposition and the gap between the fragments. So it's a sort of epistemological journey as well that has to do with Ferenczi's theory. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question on the front. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this enriching talk and also for the many images. Many of them were new to me as well, by Hannah Hoch. I have more of a little comment, something to add to the word amphimixis, which is, I think, important for the question of bioanalysis in general. As you said, a word that refers to mingling and mixing, but to put it even more specific, both Freud and Ferenczi, in particular Ferenczi, they take this notion from Weismann, from August Weismann, for whom this was the mingling of genetic material of the germ cells. So I just wanted to point out that this is something that Weismann uses as an argument for claiming that the experience, the bodily experience of the individual, the experience of individuals in general, does not matter for whatever is transmitted. And it is really, I just wanted to point out how this word, the way Ferenczi uses the word amphimixis, is really against the grain of where he takes the word from in discourse. He uses it precisely to explain why the traumatic experiences do matter for something. And I think it is not a coincidence that Abraham and Torok were readers of Ferenci's Thalassa and saw something there that they articulated as a transgenerational transmission of trauma, which Ferenczi thinks of more in an organic matter, but it is still like this structure of, it is forwarding the bodily experience of the individual in a discourse where it is said that it doesn't matter anymore.
Thank you, Jenny, for this excellent comment. I agree with that use against the grain, and I would also take it further, and I don't say this very lightly. I think it is a queering method. No, he's interested in the pluralization of form in some way. So he's interested in a grammar where always you take the two and it creates something new. And we can see this throughout. And I think this is really interesting offer in a way.
Hi, thank you. That was a fantastic talk. I had a question to do with the relationship between Thalassa, this is 1924, right, Thalassa, and Beyond the Pleasure Principle. When you were talking about Ferenci's imagining of the body as a kind of democracy of organs, in which organs might operate autoerotically or cooperatively, I was immediately reminded of Beyond the Pleasure Principle and Freud's remarks about the organism as a Zellenstaat, a cooperative commonwealth of cells, those cells being able to operate autoerotically, narcissistically. The most narcissistic cells are the germ cells or cancer cells, right? The cells that either make life or make death. And then the rest of the cells just kind of get on living more or less selflessly, some of them deeply selflessly, sacrificing themselves in a mode of apoptosis for the greater good of the organism. Freud doesn't invent this, he borrows it from cell biology. The term Zellenstaat comes from Virchow. It's not his own thing, but he makes it his own. And I just wondered how far, if you have any kind of ideas about this, how far Ferenci's account of the organism as a democracy of organs might owe something to, or might be tipping its hat, so to speak, to Freud's deployment of the figure of the Zellenstaat in Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
Yes, such an interesting question, which I think allows a clarification, which exists, of course, in the volume that Jenny and Herman and Philippe edited, which is, of course, that we now know that Thalassa was written during the Second World War, so it was published, the First World War, so it was published much later. So in a sense, that turns on its head the question of influence. Is definitely a mutual field of influence, but I think also given the beautiful way in which Jenny and Herman and Philippe have worked in this book with coloring the text additions from various years, this for me has allowed a total explosion of this text and sort of encountering a more Ferencian Freud in the end of the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and to see this approximation as indeed a complex field of influence, which is not you see Ferenczi beyond the pleasure principle influencing Ferenczi, but I think it's rather, I would hypothesize, and maybe Herman and Jenny can comment as well, that it's exactly the opposite. And of course, we're not trying to establish the point of origin, but precisely that the two together were working quite intensely and have left this project of bioanalysis unfinished. But of course, I also think that there is a difference between the two, and we can still color further and look at what precisely Ferenczi develops around trauma theory and fragmentation, which is his own mark. So I think that beyond the pleasure principle is rather colored by theory, by a vision of Ferenczi. You know, it's a whole way of looking really at fragmentation and what can a fragment do. And I think this question influenced Freud profoundly, and in ways that now we have perhaps also more historical clarity to explore.
Are there any more questions? Then maybe we can wrap up this panel. Thank you very much, Raluca.